I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Scott for that very nice introduction. Before I start lecturing, I want to ask, I have an important question to ask you guys, which is there anybody who's infallible? Good, good. So you just taken the first step in admitting that you could be wrong. I also can be wrong. It is a characteristic of the scientific method. The core characteristic of the scientific method is to not just admit the possibility that you could be wrong, but to actively embrace the concept that you are likely wrong. And so if everything else that goes on this morning bores you to tears, what I'd like you to keep in mind is the following lesson. So much of what one hears about public policy or important debates that our society is having tends to come in the form of a claim. And it tends to be stated with this sort of certitude. X caused Y. Inequality is at its highest point ever. Schools underperform because of teachers' unions. Now, these may all be true statements. They may be true statements. But it would be better if they were phrased as hypotheses. The hypothesis, for example, about schools would have the form of schools would perform better if we didn't have teachers' unions. It's an open-ended, then you actually start with an open-ended question. Why do schools underperform? Well, first, how would you measure underperformance? And second, it admits the possibility there could be many causes. And if you advance the hypothesis, oh, they underperform because of teachers' unions, it's now testable. And it is the duty of the person who's advancing the claim to not just look for the evidence consistent with their view, but to look for the evidence that contradicts their view. So if there's nothing else I leave you with this morning, it's the idea that every time you hear somebody make a strong claim, it's to ask them two questions. A, what's the hypothesis? And B, what set of facts, if true, would cause you to change your mind? This is, so I've been teaching, you can tell by all my gray hair, and if I turn around, you'll see my bald spot. I've been teaching for a very long time, and one of the things that people ask me, well, what's changed? And one of the things that's changed is the certitude with which people will assert hypotheses to be true and not phrase them as hypotheses, assert them as the truths. So I have three goals here this morning with that preamble. And the first is to demonstrate why well-specified and strongly enforced intellectual property rights are a key component of modern economic growth. And the second is to demonstrate that U.S. policymakers and courts have weakened the U.S. intellectual property system over the last 10 years. And the third is to circle around to what I was just talking about, which is to demonstrate the power of the scientific method to winnow out the false and untenable when it comes to claims about public policy. To develop the habit of asking all the time, what is the question? What is the hypothesis? What set of facts, if true, would cause us to reject this hypothesis? Now, I have two ways that I can do this. One is to sort of lecture sort of extemporaneously and engage you guys, and the other would be to read the small print book verbatim as fast as possible. I thought you guys would like the former rather than the latter. I think that's funny. One of the important components, in fact, of the scientific method is to be playful. We must be open to the idea of playing with ideas, just like this idea that I could read this small print book to you about Central Asia, which you'd be fascinated by. So playfulness, in fact, one of the one of the necessary ingredients of the scientific method is a willingness to play with ideas, to not embrace them as if they are fundamental truths, but be willing to push them, play with them, toss them around and see whether or not they'll stand up to both your inquiries about the reasons for them and the evidence for them. So what does it mean to think scientifically? First, it means pose an open-ended question. The question can have any answer. Second, to frame a clearly stated hypothesis such that you could find for the null. So I'm going to advance the hypothesis today that intellectual property rights are a key component of modern economic growth. I have to be willing to phrase the question in such a way that the null could be true. That is, that intellectual property rights are not a key component of economic growth. You have to lay out the reasons in support of the hypothesis, and then you have to present the evidence in support of the reasons, and then you have to ask whether or not the reasons are based on first principles, whether they're logically consistent and logically complete. So, what's the reason for your hypothesis? Well, because America. That's not a logically consistent, logically complete statement. You have to consider whether the alternative hypotheses are consistent with the same evidence. And then you must search for the evidence that falsifies the hypotheses. And we're going to spend a lot of time this morning, in fact, doing that. The goal is to, as I said before, is to be able to answer the question, what set of facts, if true, or what set of reasons would make me change my mind? Now, there's an advantage to this, and it's not about not fooling other people. The easiest person to fool is yourself. This is why the scientific method exists. It came into use not because it was charming and not because you could overcome other people's objections. It kept us from deceiving ourselves, and we are really, really good at deceiving ourselves. It has a positive externality, which is once you've admitted you can fool yourself, and that you should always be searching for the facts that, if true, should cause you to change your mind, it's now possible to have a discussion with someone else who's not predisposed to agree with you, in which you're both trying to find the truth. This is, if there's one thing, second thing I hope you take away this morning, it's when you meet somebody who does not agree with you, a very effective way to engage that person is to ask them what set of facts, if true, would cause you to change your mind. If they say there's no set of facts, well, then you're done. There's nothing more to talk about, because we're now talking about theology. But if they're open, but they have to admit, oh, I'm closed-minded about this issue. There are no set of facts. So if they say, oh, there's no set of facts, they go, okay, you're closed-minded. We don't have to talk anymore. Now it's like, oh, no. So now you have created an environment in which you admit you could be wrong, they have to admit they could be wrong, and you go look for the facts. Okay, so now let's get down to business. Intellectual property rights. One of the main claims I'm going to make here is intellectual property rights are an important source of growth. So what's the reasons? Well, I don't know if in economics anybody actually reads Adam Smith anymore, but he made this point back in the 18th century that economic growth is the outcome of productivity gains, and productivity gains are the outcomes of specialization, which is why he has the example of the pin manufacturer in the book. Specialization is only possible if there's a market. That is, if you can divide tasks up such that a production chain produces something organized in a market rather than if there's central control. A market can only exist if there's a demand for a good or service and there's a property right that allows the agent to appropriate the returns from their investment. That is, you're not going to invest if you don't think you can earn a return. One of the key points I want to make today is that an intellectual property right, a patent, a copyright, a trademark, is a property right like any other property right. And it can generate It has the effects of any other property right in the face of the demand curve. The only difference is that an intellectual property right is typically bounded in time, as opposed to, let's say, a claim on real property. I thought I'd give an illustration of this. One of the TAs was telling me I used this slide last year, and it made him want a cookie. So there'll be a quiz afterwards, and the quiz question is, was there really a Mrs. Fields? And the answer is yes. She lived in Palo Alto. And after she created Mrs. Fields Cookies and has a trademark on Mrs. Fields Cookies, she sold it to a private equity firm and divorced Mr. Fields. So the cookie is an interesting example because in order to produce this cookie, do I need to own a wheat farm, a dairy farm, or a cacao plantation? And I hope the answer is no. I can buy all those things in the market. Do I need to build the oven and the cookie sheets myself? No, I can buy those in the market from specialists. Do I even need to make the cookie dough myself? No, I can get it in a tub at Safeway. I'm told it's pretty good even if you don't bake it. In other words, the cookie is the outcome of a complex web of contracts. If you took away the property rights that underpinned the web of contracts, the claim that the oven manufacturer, for example, has that that's my oven and you have to pay me for it, or the claim that of Mrs. Fields, in the case of a Mrs. Fields cookie, that I have a trademark on Mrs. Fields Cookies. You cannot use the name Mrs. Fields Cookies without paying me a royalty for it or buying a franchise from me. If you took all that away, the entire web breaks down. There's no incentive for anybody to participate in the market. And a cookie now requires that you actually own all the inputs before you can make the cookie. Now, this gets us to a very interesting question about what an intellectual property right is. If you're Mrs. Fields, for example, what can be patented? Not the cookie. Mrs. Fields did not invent the cookie. My mother invented cookies. Actually, the word cookie is a Dutch word. So again, if you learn nothing else, here's a trivial fact. Amongst the great things the Dutch gave us were cookies. That and Bruce Springsteen. Dutch last name. So the cookie cannot be patented. The oven that bakes the cookie, ovens are not patentable because ovens have existed since antiquity. However, an improvement to the oven that kept the temperature exactly at 425 degrees and distributed the heat perfectly evenly throughout the oven, that would be patentable. So the patents are only incremental. You can't patent a cookie. You can't patent the idea of a book. It already exists. But you could patent an improvement to the way you bind a book. And you can patent an improvement to the way you bake a cookie. Is any of this copyrightable? Potentially the recipe might be. Now, let's move from cookies to another product you guys care about. I'm willing to bet this book. That's not much of a bet because you guys don't want it. But I'm willing to bet that book that there is 99% of the people in the room owns one of these gizmos on the right, this smartphone thing. At my age, we're not allowed to use them. I'm allowed to use this thing over here. That's the original Motorola Dynatac mobile phone. It weighed a kilo. I'm not making this up. It weighed a kilo. It's mostly a battery, which is why it's so big and heavy. It could make a call that lasted half an hour before the battery ran down. And it was the size of a brick. And it cost, in today's terms, $10,000. Yeah. Which is why if you watch 1980s music videos, I know like late at night, you're not doing anything, right? You're hanging out. If you're like, I don't know where you would find these, I guess on YouTube, you watch 1980s music videos, you'll see rock and roll stars walking around in airports with these as part of the video showing how cool they are. Of course, it's not cool anymore. In fact, mostly these things were found in cars, not because the car needed to make a call, but you needed the car battery to power the thing. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, this is some generation of an iPhone. And the average smartphone today, worldwide, costs $295. And it will not only make a call, in fact, you guys have them so you don't have to talk to people. You can send a text, you can send an email, you can send a picture of yourself that disappears. You should, however, use it to call your grandparents every week. That's not a joke. If you want to make the world a better place, start by calling your grandparents. It will also geolocate you, get you a mortgage. I'm even told you can watch a movie on it. You can watch reruns of the Gilmore Girls. I'm even told it'll get you a date. In other words, this is a supercomputer in your pocket that has more computing power than the Apollo 13 mission to the moon, and it costs $295. What moved this thing here on your left to the smartphone here on the right? And the answer is hundreds of firms, all of which had intellectual property rights, almost all of which got patented, that miniaturized the phone and that allowed the phone to do all these very, very cool things, and that did it by driving down the price of the phone. It's only an acronym, we call it a phone. Almost none of those patents are actually owned by the company whose name is on your phone. They're companies you've never heard of. What allowed this, one of the most fast-paced technological advances in human history, forget recent human history, in human history, was all the intellectual property rights that allowed firms to transact. There are firms that all they do is create patents or is create technologies that they patent and then license to other firms that allows the phone to work more effectively. You may find that really boring, but trust me, there's a lot of money in this for patent lawyers. The point I want to make is this. There's a third point I want to make to you that I want you to remember is the patents did not grant anybody a monopoly over a phone or a cookie. One of the most pernicious falsehoods about patent systems and intellectual property rights broadly is that they grant temporary monopolies. No, they don't. They grant a temporary property right that people could transact over. So I want you to imagine, and we're going to do a thought experiment here. Imagine you invented something. It could not be reverse engineered. Someone else couldn't take it apart and figure out how you did what you did. Imagine there's a demand for this. Would you patent it? The quintessential example is Coca-Cola. It's a trade secret. There's not a patent on Coke. There's a patent on the can, but there's not a patent on Coke. There's like 4 people who know the precise formula. And there are kind of complicated trade secret laws that prevent them from taking that knowledge elsewhere. There's a number of products like that. So if you actually had something that would give you a monopoly, you would not patent it. You would do exactly the opposite. Rather, the patent gives you a property right that you can transact over. You can lease it to somebody else. I'll let you use my patent if. This is, in fact, how the whole smartphone ecosystem works. So the next time you're watching reruns of the Gilmore Girls on your phone at 2 o'clock in the morning, thank the good people at MPEG LA who commercialized the audio and video codecs and charge about 25 cents a phone to do it.